All right, all you lovely people. I did get my Cheetos and they're very good. By the way, is it weird that when I haven't finished a bag of Cheetos, I put it in the fridge because I don't want like ants or bugs to get into it? My wife is going to be horrified when she sees me. She's going to be like, why are there Cheetos in the fridge? And I'm like, because I didn't want spiders to get into it, obviously. And she's going to be like, what are you doing in this house that there's spiders? The spiders have free reign here. I'm terrified. They're coming in for the heat, I think. Anyway. Oh, never live alone. It's always have roommates to keep you honest. All right. Or get married. They'll keep you honest too. Oh, man. Anyway, what was I talking about? Constraints. Yes. Much more fun than my bachelor sort of life. Oh, I never thought it would happen again. Okay, what are we talking about? Constraints. Let's get back on. Now, so recall at the end of the last video, I had presented, the problems for the constraint against harm. Namely, a lot of people think the constraint against harm is specifically a constraint against doing active harm, but it's not. There's not a constraint against allowing passive harm. Allowing passive harm may be acceptable in certain situations. And then we've seen some problems now with that distinction, especially I'll just focus now on that first trolley example again. Go back to that trolley example because virtually everyone in this class was okay with pulling the lever to save the 5 lives. And so all of you, or those of you who pulled the lever, you were willing to do active harm to that one person and, killing that one person to save the other 5. Now, most deontologists, again, deontologists are people who would like there to be constraints. So yes, so most deontologists want a few things. Most deontologists, they want a constraint against harm. What have we been talking about? Yeah, so most deontologists, one, there should be a constraint against harm. 2, that constraint should forbid chopping up Chuck. That was what got us started on this whole thing. So 1, they want a constraint against harm. 2, they want that constraint to make sure that we can't chop Chuck. 3, most deontologists also want it to be okay, to be permissible to pull the lever in the trolley example. So we have to figure out how can we get all 3 things. Again, a constraint against harm. The constraint applies to save Chuck, but the constraint does not apply to pulling the lever. And as we've seen, the distinction between doing and allowing doesn't do that. If that's what the constraint against harm is, if it's the constraint against doing harm, the constraint against doing harm seems to save Chuck. That's good. But the constraint against doing harm seems to forbid pulling the lever. So now what? Where are we at? Well, here's another distinction. Now, this one is also common in medical ethics. This is known sometimes as the doctrine of double effect. That's the only time I'm going to talk about it. Take that medical ethics class. You'll find out why they call it the doctrine of double effect. It's an interesting idea, but I will just keep it simpler, and I will call this the distinction between intending harm and foreseeing harm. Again, the distinction between intending harm and foreseeing harm. Now, so what are these? So let's talk about intending harm first. This one's the more complicated one, unfortunately. So, because it has 2 parts to it. What does it mean to intend harm? Well, you can intend harm in 2 different ways. The first way you can intend harm is that you intend for the harm itself to happen because it is one of your goals or desires or ends. Yes, the idea is that you have goals and desires, and amongst those goals and desires is to cause this harm. I mean, that's what a sadist is. A sadist desires to do harm to another person. That is one of their specific goals, is to do this harm. And so again, that's the first way you can intend harm, is that you really want that harm itself to happen. It's one of your goals. You desire that harm to happen. And that, sadism is like that. But there is a second way, a different way, but it still also intends harm. That's where the harm itself is an essential means. Again, the harm itself is an essential means to one of your goals or one of your purposes. And that is why you let the harm happen. Again, you intend the harm because it's a means to one of your ends, to one of your goals. And that's why you will allow or let the harm happen or do the harm, whatever. The harm's going to happen And it's happening because it's an essential means to getting whatever it is you want. So again, to achieve a goal or end, you absolutely need that harm to happen. And that's the example of the drowning child. That's why both examples, both scenarios of the drowning child are wrong, is because in both cases, the child has to die. Your cousin has to die in order for you to get your inheritance. Because your goal or your desire is the big inheritance, but your cousin has to die for you to get it. And so the death of your cousin is an essential means to your end. Because, you won't get the inheritance if they're still alive. And so that's the reason why you want the harm to happen. Either whether you're drowning the cousin yourself or just watching your baby cousin die. So again, that's all intending harm. Again, intending harm happens in can happen in one of two ways. It can either be because you're desiring the harm itself, like a sadist. That's your goal, that's your end. Or you intend the harm because it's an essential means to one of your goals, and that's the reason why you're letting the harm happen. Okay, so that's all that was about intending harm. That's different from foreseeing harm. And foreseeing harm means that, yes, you are aware a harm will occur. You see the harm coming. You're not ignorant that there will be harm, but that harm is not your goal. That harm is not your end. And you don't want that harm to happen as a means for one of your ends. The harm is just a side effect that's going to happen, an unfortunate side effect that you don't want to happen, you don't desire it to happen, and it happening is not an essential means to your end. Because again, so the idea is you'd still do the action even if no harm occurred. Because notice, the sadist doesn't treat the harm as a side effect. Of course not. The harm is the whole point for a sadist. And similarly for the drowning cousin conundrum, I like saying that too. The harm to your cousin is not a side effect. That is the essential means for you to get your inheritance. So harm has to happen. So here's an example then of foreseeing harm. I haven't given you one yet. So an example of foreseeing harm is where you're buying the last ticket to see DJ Khaled. DJ Khaled. You guys don't like DJ Khaled? Is he not popular anymore? Was he ever popular? I don't know. Okay, well, what about Taylor Swift? When you are young, they assume you know nothing. No? She's not popular either? Is she? I don't know. I hear her on the radio. Okay, fine. But let's be non-controversial. Post Malone. Man, if you don't want to see Post Malone, then the world doesn't even understand. So okay, where am I? You buying the last ticket to see Post Malone in New York City. That buying the last ticket, yes, that is a foreseeable harm, but you buying it is not an intentional harm. What do I mean by all that? That is, you're about to buy the last ticket to see Post Malone. And you know that other people, because it's Post Malone, are going to be sad and miserable that they don't get to see Post Malone in New York City. But look, harming those people, I hope, is not your goal or desire. Your goal or desire is to see Post Malone in New York City. That your goal is not to hurt anyone's feelings, nor, is their sadness a means for your goal or desire. That is, there's no reason why they have to be sad and miserable for you to see Post Malone. So their sadness, their misery is just a foreseeable side effect. You see it, you know it's going to happen. There's going to be disappointed, unhappy people, but when you buy that last ticket, but you clearly don't intend for them to be hurt. So that's the idea. So this is the distinction between intending versus foreseeing harm. And if you could accept a constraint against harm, you probably then might like the idea that this is a constraint against intending harm. Yeah, so we take that constraint against harm and make it a constraint against intending harm. Because foreseeable harm, that can always be out there, but that's might be permissible in cases like when you buy the last ticket to Post Malone. You're not violating any constraints, even though there is foreseeable harm and all those other disappointed people. But look, notice that then this new distinction does make drowning your cousin in the drowning cousin conundrum wrong all the time, right? Because you intend the harm either by physically drowning them or just by letting them drown. In either case, you intend their death as an essential means to getting what you want, the inheritance. However, the same distinction between intending and foreseeing harm may have permitted the dropping of the atomic bomb during World War II. Because that's the example that Rachel's give about bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was dropping those bombs was clearly doing active harm to all those civilians. You can't deny it. Dropping the bombs was doing active harm. However, Harry Truman and the United States did not intend that harm. That is, the war strategy was not about causing civilian deaths to get the enemy to surrender. The war strategy was about decisively crushing the Japanese military and end the war quickly so there wouldn't have to be a land invasion of Japan. And I'll pause and just note here for fairness that there is some debate about whether what I just said is true. What I mean, some people do believe that killing of massive, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the intent was massive civilian deaths to get Japan to surrender. I won't settle that question. It's controversial, may or may not be true. I'm not an expert on the topic. I'll just set that aside to note that it is possible, at least it's possible, that there can be a military intent to take out, a military target and not to kill the civilians. Again, in those cases, dropping the bomb, I guess might be okay because it doesn't violate the constraint against intending harm. The civilian deaths are harms that are foreseeable, but those weren't the intent behind it because they weren't absolutely essential for achieving the end. What was essential was destroying the military, not the civilians. And that's I take a course on just war theory, ethics of warfare, and this doctrine of double effect, this intending versus foreseeing harm always comes up. So again, we're talking about a constraint against intending harm, and some people think, aha, this can solve the trolley problem. Yes, so because pulling the lever may violate the constraint against doing harm, but pulling the lever does not violate the constraint against intending harm. Yes, pulling the lever does harm to that one person. If you pull the lever, you have done harm. But did you intend that harm? Well, it seems that the killing of that one person on the other track, well, you didn't desire that, and that wasn't necessary. That was just an unfortunate side effect, is that the trolley was diverted and killed that one person. Yeah, what was necessary was pulling the lever and diverting the trolley. What was not necessary was that one person having to die. That's just an unfortunate side effect. And so now you're probably feeling like, aha, I'm really good. I pulled the lever. I'm okay. Some of you poor people, I'm always the party pooper. I know. Because look, let's go back to that second trolley. Oh, you knew it was going to come, right? The second trolley example, where you can push the large man on the track to save 5. Because obviously, based on your answers, I'd say at least half of you thought there was definitely a constraint against harming the large man by pushing the large man. Now, certainly, if we have a constraint against doing harm, yes, you do harm to that large man by pushing them. But notice, we've given up that constraint. The constraint isn't against doing harm. The constraint is against intending harm. But does the constraint against intending harm save the large man? Does the constraint against intending harm forbid you from pushing the large man onto the track? After all, couldn't I, Professor Gray, push the large man and say, pushing the large man and stopping the trolley is what saved the lives. Pushing the large man, stopping the trolley, that's what was necessary. Killing the large man, that was not necessary, nor did I desire it. It's just an unfortunate side effect that the large man will not survive being pushed onto the tracks. I wish he could. I wish the trolley would just bounce off him. But alas, he's not that large. He will die. But notice, I've just changed everyone's reasoning now, or I've argued, it seems like now I've used that constraint in ways that we didn't seem to want. because now it's okay to push the large man. Again, if the constraint is against doing harm, yeah, don't touch the large man. You violated it. But if it's about, I just foresee the harm. I foresee he will die when I push him. And that's unfortunate, but that's not my intent. My intent is to save the 5 lives down the track. And let's go back to Chuck. Now, this one I will say I'm not 100% convinced about for reasons we'll see in a moment. But I think at least by that example of the large man, if what I said about the large man is true, this might also apply to Chuck. Because now certainly the constraint against doing harm says don't chop Chuck. But again, we gave up that constraint in favor of the constraint against intending harm. But does the constraint against intending harm actually forbid you from chopping up Chuck? After all, couldn't the doctor just chop up Chuck and then the doctor says, chopping up Chuck and giving away his organs? It's the chopping and the giving away that saved the lives. Chuck dying without his organs, that was neither desired nor necessary. It's just an unfortunate side effect that Chuck cannot survive without all of his organs. Okay, now there might not, I honestly say, I don't know if that works. That might not work. So I'll let you think about that. Maybe is Chuck saved by the constraint against intending harm? Maybe. But to repeat, I'm not entirely convinced that the large man is saved by the constraint against intending harm, because your intent isn't let the large man die. Your intent is that his body physically stops the train. And if that's true, then we have problems still. I will say we could go deeper, and I think there's ways around some of that. But then we get other problems. It just never ends. But I figure you've at least seen a few layers of the controversy and the challenges about constraints, because the constraint against harm is a very powerful idea. And a lot of people are deontologists because they want a constraint like that. They want something that's that firm and powerful against being, sacrificed for the overall good. Yeah, so people do think deontology for these reasons is better than consequentialism, and especially better than utilitarianism, because we get rights that really matter and aren't just instrumental. So I'll let you think about that. Again, I've just showed you at least the challenge, though, that we have with constraints, especially with that constraint against harm. What does it actually mean? What does it actually require? It's fun. All right, well, I think it's time to remove some arm flaps. So pat yourself, twice on the back, because you're almost done with another module. Take that module quiz, do some light tweeting, and of course, start thinking about that Unit 4 exam, which is coming up pretty quickly. But I hope you don't have to worry about that right now. Instead, I just hope you have a chance to, take care, stay safe.